evening. Welcome everyone to conversation with the Right Reverend Chris Harper, Anglican Bishop of Saskatoon. We welcome Chris with us this evening. We're very excited to have him to speak about a pathway to truth and reconciliation. Bishop Harper is the 13th Bishop of Saskatoon and has been since November 2017? Is that right, or 2018? 2018, there we go, yes, November 2018. He's born in Saskatchewan, hails originally from Onion Lake Cree Nation, and is a graduate of Toronto School of Theology of Wycliffe College. His parish ministries have included On Reserve, Off Reserve, and shared ministry with the Lutheran ELCIC, the largest parish being 3 main points with 6 part-time ministries and overseeing 10 communities. So there's a big rural parish. His priestly ministries have been in the Diocese of Saskatchewan, the Diocese of Algoma, and the Diocese of Toronto as the Indigenous Native Priest and Toronto Urban Native Ministry. Bishop Chris has worked with many committees in the Church, currently with the Joint Anglican Lutheran Commission, where I'm also with him, and the Anglican Church of Council, Anglican Church of Canada Council of General Synod, General Synod Planning Committee, Provincial Synod, Diocesan Executives, Saskatchewan and Algoma, as well as with Ecumenical and Interfaith Ministries, and he's a past member of the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples. Bishop Chris is widely traveled. He now happily calls Saskatoon home, where he lives with his wife of 40 years, Tracy. They together have 2 children and 4 grandchildren, so we're very excited to have Bishop Harper with us. I should mention that we are on Treaty 6 territory, and we recognize that, and on the homeland of many Métis nations. And we give thanks for Chris's presence with us this evening, and look forward to learning more about reconciliation and ways that we can move it forward. So thank you.
I suppose as we're about ready to start here, in a day and an age of technology, and so I'm going to ask anyone if you have a cell phone that you mute it for just a little bit and have somebody that you can depend on that will be beside you to tell you to turn it back on. I used to joke that unless you're expecting a call from God, but you might want me to take that for you. But when we talk about reconciliation, it is one of those multifolded words that seem to flow off the tongue just so well. And it seems that oftentimes that reconciliation seems to be one of those things that we talk about, we pray about, we negotiate and try to work our way through and all about. But it's never been perceived as something we do. So when I looked it up in the dictionary, reconciliation is a noun, and which basically says that it is the making of peace between 2 enemies. I'm not sure if I like that word, or that translation or description, but it is also a reality too of what we are. I always wanted to be able to turn it into a verb, something we do. Reconciliation, working to change, working to be renewed. I always try to start out with a prayer. So how many know Cree here? Plains Cree. Okay, I should be safe. The reason I say that, my mother was in residential school, and I am the oldest of the children. And I remember when we left the reserve, my mother had taught me, as she had been told and taught herself, that don't speak Cree because it's a dead language and you'll never amount to anything if you speak it. So I have been working for years to try to slowly get my language back. And so I'm going to say a Cree prayer for you, and I'll give you the English translation as we go along. Let us pray. Detauinan, our Father, Kisimaneto, the Creator, Wichianan mina, help us. Ganaya minuan, protect us, anoch, today. Because kisses all day. Nienan, kitwelamasimizak. We are your children. Not beoak, not beesak. All boys and men. Iskiwak, iskiwisak. All girls and women. Ekwa gakyo, and all others. Kotaka, of all nations. Asiniwakota, all people here. Eskiek, all the world. Kita tahaminan, we are thankful. Hi, hi. Thank you. I was once blessed to be able to do a greeting and do a smudging ceremony for an interfaith gathering. And it was one of those moments of being able to bring reconciliation also to the people that came to that, to talk about what we are as a people of the world and a people of all faiths, and how we have that yearning, that emptiness within all of us to seek the Creator God. And it was one of those wonderful, beautiful moments. So I got to open up and I addressed everybody and I greeted everybody the way that Archbishop Mark MacDonald always does. And I said, I greet you, all my relatives, for we are one in the family of God's creation. We are one in the family. We are one in this locality now. I greet you, each and every one of you, my relatives, and I welcome you to this place. I welcome you to this land that we call Canada. This land is wide and expansive, not expensive unless you live in Vancouver, maybe Edmonton, Calgary, I don't know. But I welcome you. There's room enough for all of us. Each and every one of us, there's room for us all. And if we could greet each other and welcome each other and walk with each other, we would be one again in creation. One as we were meant to be. And so I went on with the smudging ceremony, and everyone seemed to be very well happy and understanding and agreeing with it. And they worked very well with it. And it wasn't until at the very, very end of my time there, and where I was going around and meeting everybody after this service went together and after it was all completed. And a gentleman came up to me and he grabbed my hand and he was shaking it ever so vigorously as he talked and kept on shaking it as we talked along. And he says, I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for your words today. He says, I'm a new immigrant to this Canada. I've been living here now for 5 years. 5 years. And nobody has ever welcomed me until today. For the first time, Canada feels like my home. And I said, well, thank you. I said, well, welcome. And he said, now, I just got to say, this is such an honor to meet you. And he says, now I can phone the people back home in the other country and tell them I met a true Indian. From one high right to the next, you know. But it is. It's incredible on how we as human beings are constantly trying and seeking to find what reconciliation means and how we can come together. The path to, we'll take you back for a second. I'm sorry, everybody. Maybe I'll use the word click. How is that? Does it make sense? I'll use the word click. You can go back to the first intro where it shows me looking so ever so wise and the very, very beginning, yours, yes. I was never sure if I ever liked that picture. That was one of the first pictures that the photographers wanted to take of me in a cathedral, right? When I was just elected as bishop. And they said, well, sit there and look contemplative and look like, that you've just received divine inspiration. And so I was sitting there, and I don't know if you've ever been in where the kids have balloons, and the balloon went up into one of these fans, and it got caught, and there was a string that was going. I go, hey, a string. And that's me. Just in case you think very highly of me, I want to bring you back to reality. Okay, click. In life, we try to take things and make things too easy, too simple. We don't like the hard way. And I thought this was a great commentary on the way we do things in life. The basics of music theory. Make music in 3 minutes. Everyone's lined up for that. When we talk about reconciliation, everyone wants to just hear the fancy words or just go through, talk to us for a while, talk nice. Or somebody said, once to me, so you're indigenous, you're First Nation, you're an Indian. I said, yeah. Well, say something in Indian for me then. I said, well, my Hindi's not that good. So, click. Before I start, I want to give credit to my wife. When we were, after I was elected bishop, which, with my wife, I asked her, I said, would you make something for me that it sort of is indicative of who I am and what I am and what we are together in this ministry? And so she put this beautiful setting here with my Bible, which has traveled with me from in many, many places in many countries that I've been honored to be in, and a chalice that was given to me from BC, from a church that was closing and where I was asked to be an honored preacher, and of course a braid of sweetgrass that my aunt had given me. And in the back there you see a bundle of white sage that my daughter gave to me after her and my grandchildren picked it. And so that all sits together. And an eagle feather, which the chief and council gave to me when I graduated and got my MDiv from the University of Toronto. And so all of that is leaning and is propped up by the scriptures in the Bible. And so that has been sort of my symbol, and which I've got on my thank you cards, my greeting cards, that for the Diocese of Saskatoon. And so I give credit to my wife, who is much more artistic than I, and she is my strength, and at the same time she is the great supporter and pusher of me to be able to do these things. Without her support, I probably would be hiding at home right now. So I give thanks to Tracy for that. Click. Truth. John 4:23-24. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. And indeed, the Father seeks such people to worship him. God is spirit. And those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Click. Reconciliation. 2 Corinthians 5:18-21. And all this is from God, who has reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. Namely, God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. So we are ambassadors for Christ, as if God were appealing through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God. For our sake he has made him to be the sin who did not know sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Click. Truth, more than just a word. Canada borrows its name from a Huron Iroquois word, kanata, which means village or settlement. Indian youths traveling with the French explorer Jacques Cartier in 1535 used the word to describe the village of Stadacona, the site of the present-day Quebec City. The words that we use, like I said at the very beginning, reconciliation, are often those words that seem to flow off the tongue but stick when it actually gets to doing something. We find that more so in the church. Click. If this was a little bit clearer, you'd be able to see all the nations of all across Canada, United States, going down into Mexico and up north. Those are all the different nations that are often not mentioned in our histories. Now, if you're like me, you probably, when you went to school, you learn more about the Soviet Union, Russia. You learn more about the United States. You learn more about France, You learn more about the explorers, but you never learned anything about the indigenous people. And so often in those times, you become disconnected to the reality of what we have here in this land. And a click. I did a presentation on the doctrine of discovery in one locality, I'm not going to say where, and I talked about how many indigenous people were in this big city. And I remember one lady, she come up after and she said, you know, I very much loved your presentation. Oh, that was phenomenal. That was a lot of information, my goodness. But you know, you said there was this many people living in the city. And I said, yes. And she goes, well, I'd like to challenge you on those numbers. And I said, because, well, I'm going to give it to you. 179,000 indigenous people living in Toronto. And she goes, I want to challenge you on those numbers. And I said, oh. And she goes, because you said that there's 179,000 indigenous people in Canada. And I said, did I say Canada? Oh, I'm sorry, I meant Toronto. She said, no, you mean Canada. I said, no, just Toronto. Really? I find that hard to believe. I didn't even know we had reserves here in Toronto. And I said, oh my dear, they let us off the reserve now. You know, since 1960, 1964, they allowed us now to leave the reserve without a writ or a permission from the Indian agent. We're allowed to do things now in this land of Canada. And she goes, I find that hard to believe. I thought they only allowed you people to live in parts of BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And I said, oh no, we're everywhere. We're probably your neighbor and you don't even know it. I said, we are everywhere. In fact, I said, Canada is still ours. I said, every year I receive $5 rent from you. In my treaty money, I get this wonderful honor of being able to be greeted by an RCMP officer in red serge who pulls its tin box out and he opens it up and brings out a crisp, brand new $5 bill, shakes my hand, and says, thank you. I said, every year I get rent from you. Canada's still ours. So I talked about the doctrine of discovery, and the doctrine of discovery basically is that it says that the doctrine of discovery is a concept of international law that provided justification for the European possession of already inhabited lands in North America and around the globe. It has its origin in a number of papal bulls or official pronouncements from the 15th century. The doctrine posited that a Christian power could legally lay claim to any lands populated by non-Christians. The doctrine has been a driving force behind some of the world's worst abuses of indigenous people, says National Indigenous Anglican Archbishop Mark MacDonald. It was the doctrine of discovery and the ideas around it that led to the residential schools and because it said that the people were so savage and so primitive that they would be better off schooled and separated from their families, said MacDonald. And I put the quote there that you can find on the web. But it talks about the land itself. It kind of like, you know, I love mental, I have cartoons running through my mind all the time. I have to tell you that, honestly, is that, and so I can imagine that the early discoverers, and as they pulled up and as they landed on the shores of this beautiful land of the Americas, and so they stand there and they bring out the flag, you know, Jim, bring the flag, bring the flag, good. Okay, get all these people out of the way. Oh my goodness sakes, look at this, uninhabited land. You know, some of the indigenous people, what's he talking about? Who's he looking at? You know. Anyway, there goes a little cartoon in my mind. But talking about the doctrine of discovery, and how can you discover something that was not lost, that people were already living in? So it challenges the very basics of what we have and what we're put forth and posited at the very beginning when we talk about the doctrine of discovery. But at the same time, the doctrine of discovery was also that you might as well say foundation that prepared the people for, you might as well say the next words, and I'm going to pull those up, next words of assimilation. of taking a people that were supposedly so savage and so uncontrollable that they needed to be separated. And as one historian documented, and as one of the politicians had said, to kill the Indian in the child. Different ways when you start thinking about it. So click. The next one that came into being was TERRA NULLIUS, empty lands. On the 26th of June 2014, a unanimous 8-0 decision that marked the first time that the highest court recognized the existence of Aboriginal title on a particular site. The Supreme Court of Canada made clear that the doctrine of terra nullius, that no one owned the land prior to European assertion of sovereignty, never applied in Canada. So, as confirmed as by the Royal Proclamation in 1763, the RSC 1885 application to number 1. And this was against, this is the one of the First Nations of BC against the British Columbia government. But in all of this, as the court explains, at the time of assertion of European sovereignty, the Crown acquired radical or underlying title to all the land in the province. This Crown title, however, was burdened by the pre-existing legal rights of Aboriginal people who occupied and used the land prior to European arrival. The Indigenous people were here, and we are still here. And this is one of the problems that when we start to try to find the word reconciliation, reconciliation not only amongst the Indigenous peoples, but with all peoples. Because as First Nations, you hear stories. I come from Onion Lake First Nation, and just probably about 2.5 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, our chief, Henry Lewis, established and put forth that we are now in a state of emergency in Onion Lake First Nation. And the reason that we're in a state of emergency in Onion Lake First Nation is because we have such brokenness, that gangs are running rampant on the reserve. We have a population on reserve of roughly about, probably just under 5,000, and that the gangs have taken over, and that there is drugs and there is overdoses almost. And I remember last year, it seemed like there was almost a death every week and a half. And the people were in a constant state of mourning, and I remember my brother mentioned that. He said, pray for us. He says, because as leaders, we are worn out. We are tired. We are tired of all the pain and the sorrow and all and the heartache that has been going on, that we have to support our people. But we do the best with what we have. And so the question is then begged about why then, because I've heard it all. I've heard it all my life. I've been challenged all my life. I'm one of the few bishops that can say that in my time I have been sworn at, spat upon, beaten up, assaulted, threatened, shot at. I've had more knives pulled on me than I can count. And this is all reality of living who and what I am. At the same time, having the distinction, you might as well say, of being Indigenous also puts me in a different category of how people receive me and perceive me. One of the first things that I had been challenged to do was that when I was, as a parish priest, as a priest, I was always challenged about how I looked. Make sure that my parishioners or my congregation would always, they would lean over to Tracy. Father Chris's hair is getting a little bit long. Maybe you better cut it. Or else just of how I looked, right? And I remember one of the first things that I did when I took on the position of the Indigenous Native Priest for the Diocese of Toronto, I put on a new uniform, and for the first time I was able to grow my hair back. When I was young, I used to have 2 long braids, probably right down to my belt. And I remember the time that I had to have them cut to go to school, I was traumatized, and I had to have brush cuts. And I've never liked brush cuts since then. And I've been blessed to be able to have hair, and as you can see, I do have hair. And I'm one of the few bishops that does have hair, I guess I can say that. But it's also a statement. I am one of those ones that I make a statement because, number one, it challenges the religious communities. How can you be a bishop having long hair and looking the way you do? I always want to say, what about you? And at the same time, it challenges the indigenous peoples too. Because they see this as a mark of the traditional ways. And how dare I, as a Christian, have my braid? But it is who I am. It is who I am, and it is a statement that I make. Come the day that maybe nobody says anything, nobody makes a remark or a snide remark or a shot about it, then maybe I'll cut my hair. But even to this day, and I'm not going to say which store, I don't really go back to anymore. One of my favorite stores that I did like, until I met one person who questioned me about absolutely anything and everything and would not leave me alone because they were so afraid that I was going to steal something. I wanted to go to the car, put on my collar and maybe all my robes and everything else and bring my staff in and everything else, just to let them know who I am. But this is how you are received, and a lot of times that all you got to do is just go into the store and they follow you. They'll follow you and they'll watch you really closely. Only once I had a little bit of fun with it where I would walk down the aisle and I'd look at something. That's a beautiful water bottle. And they saw me doing that, so they followed me and they were looking down at the aisle and like they were trying to stalk something, watching me very closely, and I'd, well, maybe not that color, maybe I'll go with another color. And I'd go around to the other side. And as I did, they would follow me to that side, and I'd look at them, and I'd go back to the other side again. I did that about 4 or 5 times, until the final time I went up to them and I said, "You getting tired yet?" So how do we respond as people, though, when we start to see the different ways in different peoples? How do we respond? Do we respond as Christians? Do we respond as people? Do we respond, again, as Christians? Today I'm blessed to be able to speak here in this beautiful, beautiful church, the Lutheran Church, the Good Shepherd. I deal a lot with the Anglican, and I deal a lot with shared ministries, where we are in full communion with each other. I'm blessed to share the table also with my dear brother back there. And when at our last JOUC meeting, the Joint Anglican Lutheran, I mentioned something, and I said that we like to say that we're in full communion. It's a beautiful word, isn't it? But we're not there yet. I challenge you to think about this. We're not there yet. The day comes that we stop using those words, those and them, us. Those are divisive words, and they separate us apart from each other. The day that we come and we start saying, I'm Christian. Oh, by the way, and I practice in the Lutheran tradition, or the Lutheran practice. I'm Christian, but I practice in the Anglican way. That's when we start to move towards reconciliation, where we are truly in full communion with each other. And that's what we got to shoot for and gain for and hope for and pray for. It's much the same as when I ask people, what is your heritage? People will say, oh, I'm Norwegian, I've got, this, and I'm German, I've got, and everything else. I say, that's wonderful. When did you move to Canada? Oh, we've been here now for about 5 generations. I said, doesn't that make you Canadian then? But we need to start looking at things just a little bit differently about how we see things. and especially so with the sensitivities of even the language, the way our minds work. Changing that. If we can change the mind, then the heart. Click. Other words that we use. Assimilation. Assimilation, Canada's White Paper 1969 starts a wave of activism and awareness of Indigenous concerns and policies. I put it down there for you to take a look at later on. Search it up. Have you ever heard of the 1969 White Paper? And in the White Paper, it basically states that to assimilate the people, that roughly in about 15 years, there will be no more Indigenous people. So this way that the fiduciary responsibility that's being wards over these Indian people will no longer be needed. The elimination of reserves, the elimination of the treaties, the elimination of all the treaty rights. They will be just like us. Click. Rights, the rights of the Indigenous peoples. I was blessed to be able to be in New Jersey and New York probably about maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And when I was with part of AIN, which is the Anglican Indigenous Network. And we put forth a proposal to the United Nations in which we, I contributed a little bit to that, as was read at the United Nations. And it made a push for Canada to accept the rights of Indigenous peoples, which we lovingly call UNDRIP. UNDRIP, United Nations Declarations of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Do you see how we love to shorten things up? UNDRIP, now you know. And UNDRIP basically states that the Indigenous people have inherent rights of land and language, culture, tradition. And it talks about how we have these rights as human beings also within our own lands. I talk about oftentimes about even the right to vote. It was 1964 roughly about that our reserve were for the first time allowed. They were allowed to leave the reserve without a pass. You had to get a paper that's from the Indian agent that said that this person will be leaving on this date, they will return on this date, and they are going to be only going to their trap lines which are located on this land, a grid, and they would give the directions and everything else. And they would sign it. And if you exceeded that, you could be arrested. Or else, if not that, some of your treaty rights removed from you. One of them was the new thing that was given to us was voting rights, to be able to vote. I always marvel because, women had their voting rights given to women, and that was not too far, before, that was what, 1922? That's right, Bishop Chris. Okay. 1922. 1964 for the Indigenous people, we were allowed to vote. John Diefenbaker. John Diefenbaker, Prime Minister from 1957 to 1963, achieved a long-held personal goal when Parliament extended the franchise to registered Indians in 1960 with no strings attached. They were no longer required to give up their Indian status in order to vote. The right to vote is one of the great privileges of democratic society. For after all, it is you, the people, not the Gallup poll, who determine in whose hands the guidance of public affairs may best be trusted. John G. Diefenbaker, June 15th, 1962. Given the right to vote, you don't realize how these small things are so important. Click. Church and residential schools. In 1892 and 1962, church and federal government entered into the partnership of the operation of residential schools for Indigenous children. At the end of the agreement of partnership, transfer of control slowly given over to the Indian bands. Last governmental school closes in 1996, and the last band run closes in 1998. I put a question there because there's still some places that, a lot of the places, especially in Northern Ontario, where they have to send their children down south to go to school and high school. It still happens. We hear some of the conflicts that we have still in trying to acclimate and be connected to the communities and at the same time missing families. So it still continues. My reserve of Onion Lake was one of the few, I think there's only about 3 across Canada that had both a Roman Catholic and an Anglican residential school on reserve. My mother was in residential school, but because she lived in Onion Lake, she could not go to Onion Lake residential. They shipped her off way down south around Calgary. And the reason is so that this way the family would have no connection or contact, be able to contact her. And that was part of the process of division. And especially for people that was so much connected to the family unit, the community unit, if you will. Imagine the brokenness that happened when we had, especially with the elders, the grandparents. They were the teachers, they were the historians, they were the tellers of all the tales of how and why and how they lived, and told of how you were related going on down the lines. And then all of a sudden, one day, a priest, the RCMP, and the Indian agent show up at your door and say your children are going to school. And they take your children out of your house and you have no say. If you dare fight, they throw you in jail. They lock you up with your kids watching. And they take your kids, put them into a wagon, and they're all sent off. And with words, last words to you, don't try to contact them, don't send them letters, don't send them gifts, because they will all be taken away from them. And if you do, you will be punished. So, all of a sudden, now the elders, the holders of the history, the elders, the grandparents that hold all the knowledge, now look around and there's no children to teach, no children to be able to pass on the knowledge. The brokenness that happens, it's now kids in residential school raising kids. Abuses happen. Not only with the adults to the children, but the children to the children. Horror stories, and that what came out in the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation. Horror stories, ugly stories of what people went through. The brokenness and that they still live with those memories locked into their minds and on their thoughts. One of my friends, I remember him telling his story, and where he talked about how the food was not very good in the residential school that he was in. And he was forced to eat food that did not agree with him. And of course it upset his stomach and he threw up. And they forced him to eat his own vomit because nothing could be wasted. We hear about stories on and on like this, and the brokenness that happened, and the disconnect from families and family units. So when those children grew up to be parents, they had no skills of parenting because they didn't have parents. And so the brokenness, the suffering, the heartbrokenness inside, they tried to quell and try to subdue and bring down through whatever means they could, and that led to addictions, especially with alcohol. And it just perpetuated to the day where we have meth. So common, so cheap. And it continues on, the brokenness and the struggles of the people and the children. And this is generationals that have been it's been happening and passed on generational of children. So they're still learning. On the reserves, we have to have life skills, parenting skills, being taught to us still. Stunning. It's a challenge. Click. Like I said, I come from Onion Lake First Nation, also known as Siksikuch Makyo. I have a treaty number, To the federal government, I'm 344-0078301. My wife is 344-0078302. My children, now when they turned 18, they got their own numbers. And that's how we are. And we're all given these nice little cards, federal government cards, that, you know, those beautiful white cards that, you know, you have the hologram in there and everything. Oh, yeah. But that's who we are now. That's how we are identified, by these numbers. With great controversy, I say, at least it wasn't tattooed. My reserve had 2 residential, like I said, the Anglican and Roman Catholic. My mom was in residential school, and she has unspoken experiences. To this date, she still lives. Whenever I ask her, she changes the subject, and she just continues on. But she's also very proud, though she still doesn't really understand, that her son is a bishop. With a little bit of a smile, I tell you this story. I've told, you know, there's a few of the clergy that are here, and they've heard this already, but I'll tell you. When I was elected bishop, I remember talking to my mom. You know, I was talking to her just about every other week, and, you know, just just finding out how things are at home and things that are happening there. Now that I'm closer, I get to be a little bit, you know, I get to go see her more often than I did when I lived in Ontario. And so anyway, I was talking with her about, you know, the things that I'm learning and doing as a bishop, and what, you know, and she always says, well, who do you have to ask? I said, nobody, I'm the bishop. Well, who's going to give you permission to implement that? And I said, well, nobody, I'm the bishop. Well, who's above you then? I said, technically nobody, I'm the bishop. Even the archbishop can't tell me what to do in the diocese. I'm the bishop. I said, Mom, why is it so hard for you to understand that I'm the bishop? And then she sat down and she said, well, you have to understand, she says, because that doesn't happen to our people. That happens to the white people, but not to us. That's why it's so hard for her to still, even to this day, to accept and understand that I'm the bishop. So every once in a while I'll say, yeah, that I put forward new protocols on intinction, and that we're not going to be able to do that in the Diocese of Saskatoon, especially in the wake of or the reality of the coronavirus. Well, who do you have to ask permission to do that? I said, I'm the bishop. But still, it continues on. So my mom, in residential school, the unspoken experiences. Legacy that we live in. Is it just another word? The legacy that each and every one of us live in, not only in the church, but because of who we are as Christians. The legacy that we live with on a daily basis and see the brokenness in our communities within the church. Legacy is what we inherit and what is part of us and ours. Click. Indigenous peoples today, we are in the news on a constant basis. You hear now of the protests about the pipeline, and we hear the protests that are happening and happened across the land. We hear about the challenges in BC about unceded land, in other words, land that has never been given up. We hear about the land, the crown land up north, of people that are being evicted from the crown land. And from their hunting and their trapping sites. We hear about the challenges about the reserves themselves, about being able to have and do things on their own lands and the rights that they have. The rights that we have, and especially as Indigenous people, are called treaty rights. Treaty rights, which are those that are given. Now, I wish I should have brought, and I've got to start packing that with me. My brother gave me a Treaty 6 flag. And on the Treaty 6 flag, for some of you that know what it is, it's where the Indigenous man is standing there like this with his hand, shaking the hand of the white colonist on the other side, and they're shaking hands together and both feet up on a little bit of a rise, and they're standing there as equals. Treaty rights, the agreement between two peoples to act and to work together as one, and in it respecting each other, honoring each other with dignity and peace. But the treaty rights also at the same time are those things which a lot of people do not fully understand, much less comprehend. And there's so much to teach. That's one of the reasons when I asked how much time do I have, they said, well, roughly about 45 minutes. And I said, good, because I can go on for days. But one of the things I do want to talk about at least is that the treaty rights were those that were given to the Indigenous peoples as the government. So for example, at the time, they were given a $5 coin, a gold coin, which is worth $5. But as you know, that the $5 gold coin now probably, say one troy, is it a troy ounce? Troy ounce of gold is roughly worth, probably about what, 1,800 now, ballpark figure. 2,100. Sell. $2,100 now. But I still receive $5, which has not changed historically right from the very first time of the treaty, first handshake from the RCMP giving the Indigenous their treaty money. But we're the most studied people right now, but nobody knows anything about us. And the way the government works is it works to try to make itself look good all the time, and that the Indigenous people are the troublemakers and the problematics. And the reason for that is that, the way the process works. So I remember the one time I used to be sitting on a health board, and I worked with the community on that. And we were going through the negotiations to try to get it, and we did. We successfully got a wonderful gift from the government, and I think we got something like about $6 million from the federal government. And there was a great uproar about how much the Indigenous people are again getting more of the taxpayers' money. And we had to laugh about it, because the reality was that the money that we were receiving was for women and children, young mothers with their first children, to try to find them food supplements and better feeding and eating plans to make everyone healthy, to try to stave off other diseases later on. And what happened was that you have to understand how this whole process works. So $6 million that was given to the Indigenous bands across Canada for this healthcare program. But to be able to do that, they had to do a study. So the government hired public people to do studies on all the reserves, and that ate up probably close to $2 million right up there. And they went across all the lands, traveled to every reserve, did research, talked to the health departments, talked to the people themselves to find out how the money would be best implemented. Then after that, they took that money back, and the research company handed it, collated, put it all into one big beautiful package, which handed it over to the government. The government put it before the Senate moved it over to this other part here. And anyway, long story short, it went through all the different hands, and it came down to the point that when it came down back to the money to give back to the reserves, it came down to, that was roughly about, out of $6 million, it was roughly about $3.8 million that actually went to the reserves, which worked out to about $125 for a young mom and one child. But yet, the government looked good, and the Indigenous people looked bad again, because they're again getting another free handout. So all of these challenges work towards all these brokenness, the struggles that we as Indigenous peoples have. Issues, politics, and brokenness, oh my. Brokenness in societal, familial, communal, judicial, racial. The Indigenous peoples are the ones who support the corrections system very, very well. Most of the people in corrections are Indigenous. And you see that. And at the same time, our communities are broken, our families are broken, the society is broken, and what we think of as a normal is not the normal for everywhere else. We have the Indian Residential School, the IRS, the missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada that have just disappeared. My own cousin was one of them. We were able to recover part of her skull. That was it. They finally did find the guy who did murder her after probably 6 to 7 years that he was in freedom. But he didn't think anything of it that he had murdered an Indigenous person, an Indigenous woman. The 60 scoop, which is ongoing. shockingly, it's still ongoing, where they take the children out of the reserve, away from the parents, and they foster them out to other people for a better life. We have addictions, losses and identification, our language, our traditions, land, culture, and it goes on. But a lot of it's perpetuated by a lot of things that we do in our own society. We have, with the heart, as I said, truth is hard, with realities and ignorance, pride and prejudice. Boy, that'd make a wonderful title for a book, wouldn't it? Should write one up. Faith, renewal, and hope. Church and the community, people working with people. This is what we do as Christians. This is what we do as the church, to try to bring this knowledge of hope, peace, reconciliation. Hard words, especially when you take a look at it with new knowledge and a new expectation as Christians, as people of faith. Part of the challenges has also been to try to bring this into the schools. Click. Reconciliation. I'll give you the video if you ever want to look at the apology that the our then Primate Archbishop Michael Pearce gave at a National Native Convocation in Menachie, Ontario on Friday, August 6, 1993. Listening, acknowledging in truth, and seeking healing and prayerful walking together. Healing at the local level. Empty words, oftentimes reconciliation. Empty words without actions. I was once told that words are like wind. Here, then gone. Reconciliation means to be made right. So what does reconciliation mean, and what can it look like? But it begins with you and me and walking together in peace. Click. I put a lot of this on here, but I only want you to focus on number 59 and number 60. 59, when we call upon the church parties to the settlement agreement to develop ongoing education strategies to ensure that their respective congregations learn about the church's role in colonization, the history and the legacy of residential schools, and why apology to former residential school students, their families, and communities were necessary. 60, we call upon the leaders of the church parties of the settlement agreement and all other faiths, in collaboration with the Indigenous spiritual leaders, survivors, schools of theology, seminaries, and other religious training centers to develop and teach curriculums for all students and all clergy and staff who work in Aboriginal communities on the need to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right, and the history, the legacy of residential schools, and the roles of the church parties in that system. The churches and the history and the legacy of religious conflict in Aboriginal families and communities, and the responsibility that churches have to mitigate such conflicts and prevent spiritual violence. This last year in 2019, our retiring primate, Fred Hiltz, gave an apology for spiritual harm done. And where he talked about admitting the wrong that we as a church did to the Indigenous peoples, saying that their spiritual ways were evil, were satanistic, were paganistic, and it went on. And he apologized. And the Indigenous people, much the same as with Michael Pearce, with the first apology for the residential schools, gave the response back and accepting the apology. Click. Coming home. Faith in context. Truth, not always easy or comfortable, is that we are called as Christians to be people of hope in the light of Christ. Faith is our vehicle of salvation, but it also means doing something on our part. Getting involved, stepping up, loving and forgiving. Reconciliation. We are all called to be ministers and into the ministry of reconciliation and ambassadors of Christ. What do we do as Christians? What do we do as the church, Lutherans and Anglicans together? Have you said to yourself those words that I've heard so many times? Why don't they just get over it? Come on, I didn't do this. What is the purpose of all of this? Why don't they just move on? If they're having such problems on a reserve, move back, move off. Let's sell all the reserves and give them the money and help them out, and then that's it. We're done. They get everything for free. Why don't they just move on? Get a job. I've heard it all. I've seen it all. And the challenge now for us as Christians, as a church, notice I didn't say Anglican or Lutheran, but us as a church, as Christians, what are we called to do? To love and respect each other, and to honor each other as children of God's creation. You, my relatives. You, my relatives. For we are one in the family of God. We are one in this community. And change happens with us first. There is nothing that I can do to make you change. But I can show you how to change. But it starts with us. Click. I wanted to just end with just a little bit, because it's not all serious. I look at things and I see things and I hear things and I have to laugh because otherwise you cry. But before going into ministry, I used to be in EMS. I was an advanced EMT, EMTA with elevated skills and everything else to do all these things. And I remember we were going into the hospital, my partner and I, we were called to do a transfer of one patient. And when we walked into the room with our stretcher and everything else, the older gentleman, he looked up, Indians, Indians, Indians. And I said, yes, sir, how are you doing? He goes, they allow you to do this now? And I said, oh, sir, you'd be shocked at what you're allowed to do now. But this is the reality. This is where we are in this present day and age. We still have prejudice. We still have pride. We still have all these things that separate us from our brothers and sisters. And the struggle then for us is to move into a better and new direction. A place of hope. Where we do not see skin color. Where we do not judge people by the length of their hair. But instead, we judge each other with the knowledge that God loves you. God has placed you here for an amazing ministry that no one else can do in the whole world. I say this to my congregations, to the parishes, to the diocese all the time, to the groups that I visit and I meet with. And I still see the same kind of, yeah, right. But you are. There is no one else like you in this whole world. You and you alone have been placed here by God, our Creator, for a special purpose. And what that purpose is between you and the Creator God. It's something that nobody else can do. Only you. And that's how special and wonderfully made you are. Even if you're, as one of my parishioners used to say, I'm too old to do anything. I said, oh no. You have a lot of influence. You have a lot of wisdom. Use it. Teach. Guide. God has put you here for a special purpose. And to this age for a special purpose. One of my friends asked me today, how old is too old to go into ministry? I said, oh my goodness, you're never too old. So, there's hope for all of you. That God has a purpose and that God has a place for you in this ministry. We are blessed with an amazing college in the city. The LTS, Emmanuel St. Chad. Take a course. Study with them. When you see the courses that we're offering even in the Diocese of Saskatoon, sign up. Come and learn. I guarantee you'll walk away with a smile and be lovingly and blessedly challenged, as you should be with every Sunday service. Words that are sweet to the ears don't feed the heart. You need meat and potatoes and veggies. You can't live on cotton candy. I wanted to close with a Cherokee prayer, but before I do that, I wanted to read a paragraph that was attributed to Crazy Horse, a great chief of the people. And it says, in the spirit of Crazy Horse, upon suffering and beyond suffering, the Red Nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing for a sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separation, a world longing for light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole earth will become one circle again. Words attributed to Crazy Horse. A Cherokee prayer. O Great Spirit, help me always to speak the truth quietly, to listen with an open mind when others speak, and to remember the peace that may be found in your silence. Amen. I leave a thought with you to seek out and to find more about the doctrine of discovery, TERRA, empty lands, in other words. I ask you to take a look at the 94 calls to action that were put out by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I ask you to examine when we say to decolonize the church, what that means. When I ask that you look within yourself to see where pride and prejudice have separated you from your brothers and sisters in faith, no matter what their skin color is. That maybe then the church will look upon each other as brothers and sisters, as Christians, and then maybe Lutherans and Anglicans. But I close with this thought. We're in this together. God has a plan, and God's plan will be fulfilled. It will be completed in our acceptance or our rebellion. God's plan will be fulfilled. Those that get to wear the collars, God bless you, because you are given the most privileged position to watch, to see God's wonder and mystery being played out before you every Sunday and throughout the week. And where you get to look out and see the people, the interest, the rejection, the joy, the hope, the sadness, and the loss. For that's what makes up the children and family of God. All of us walking together as one in this beautiful land we call Canada. Amen. With that, I leave you now. If you have any questions, I think they allotted, 7 hours now for questions? But I invite you to ask all the questions that you've ever wanted to ask. Don't be afraid of, like I said, if don't ever think about offending me. People have tried, believe me. They've tried. But ask all the questions. There's no silly question unless it's the one that you're afraid to ask, because you never learn. Unuse the microphone, please.
From the Yukon, which is why I know the price of gold. It's on the radio
Awesome.
every morning there. In the Yukon, where I've lived for a decade, we have the majority of Canada's self-governing First Nations.
Yes.
That changes the context, and after living there a decade, I feel I'm now starting to understand this much better. There, when we acknowledge, I will acknowledge that I live in Whitehorse, which is on the settled land of the self-governing Kwanlundun First Nation and the Ta'an Council. I know what that means. I know what that means where I live, and that affects how I live. It affects how my government governs. It affects how I work and play and interact with the land. It affects a number of things, and we aren't perfect there by a long shot. But when I go outside, which is what we call it when you leave the Yukon, and we spell it with a capital O, when we go outside, I hear people acknowledging that we are on Treaty 6 land. But what does that mean? I hear it acknowledged a lot. What does that mean? In your opinion, what should it mean? How should it be affecting what we actually do in our daily lives, in our church lives?
Thank you for this question. Treaty 6. We are on Treaty 6 land, which basically entails a whole swath of land that by the governments, what they did was they went to the indigenous groups, so for quite a bit of the Plains Cree and so some of the Swampy Cree, and just in case you thought there was more than one band of Cree, that there's the Swampy Cree, Woods Cree, Plains Cree, and it goes on. Moose Factory Cree, OG Cree, James Bay Cree, and it goes on. But everywhere that the government went, they signed these treaties. And the treaty that was for this area, roughly for about the middle and going up a little bit into the north of Saskatchewan, is Treaty 6. Treaty 6 also extends a little bit into the Alberta. And to the south, around Calgary area, is Treaty 7. To the north, up and around PA and north, is Treaty 10. To the south and to a little bit more to the east, gotta get my directions right, I don't know if I'm pointing east or wherever, but to the east is Treaty 4. And then when you're in you're in the Toronto area, it's Treaty 3 to Treaty 5 and Treaty 2 and 1. So anyway, that's what they basically mean. And every one of them had a different negotiation factor and way they were done and drafted and written up. So some of the treaties dictated and indicated of how much they were supposed to receive. Some treaties, they were written that as soon as an indigenous male turned 18, he was to receive a fishing tackle, fishing net. He was supposed to receive a wagon, ammo, and it went on. Farming implements and the things like that he was supposed to receive so that he could be self-sufficient and to help lift up his family. And so some of those treaties were there that, and as a lot of these statements said, as long as the grass grows and the waters flow, these treaties will last. But nobody said that, because I love to use picture language. So I use the treaties as this beautiful, big, soft straw mattress that all the indigenous people got to lay on, right? And the government, one day said, oh, look at that, a loose straw. Pulled it out. Hey, nobody noticed. So they pulled out another straw. Removing the small treaties as they went along. To the point now where as reserves, as indigenous peoples, the straw mattress is now, and we're feeling the boards under the pallet, on the pallet, that this cloth is. And that's why the treaties themselves were fighting now to protect even the smallest treaties. I remember being once as a delegation being sent over to the Ottawa and meeting with the Mohawk. The Mohawk people are very protective of every right that they have. They're more than willing to fight. Just say the word and they'll rally. Where we here in the West have been more subdued and more controlled. And so when I came back, I talked to the chiefs and the councils that for Treaty 6 and Treaty 7, and I said to them that we need to be more militant, to stand up for our rights and to speak about what our rights are and to protect them, not for us, but for our children's children's children. So that this way we as a people can continue. For we as a people, that we will be able to stand strong. So even when you take a look at the Treaty 6, as long as the sun shines, I have problems with S's and H's, bear with me. As long as the sun shines, there we go, and the rivers flow, the grass grows, that those treaties will be honored and respected. God bless the government. They haven't held up their right, their end of the bargain. I love the old movies. They spoke with a forked tongue. I've always wanted to say that, but I was scared to all the time. But you can see again that it's about equality. It's again about giving back the rights to the people and what was inherently theirs. And that's where we talk about, the treaties and how important that they are. But thank you very much. Did I even come close to answering your question? Yes. Exactly. Okay, good. The acknowledgement is just one small step. It's just one small step, because I remember one person asked me, well, what is the proper wording for the acknowledgement that we should use in this territory? And I said, first find out what territory you're in. Find out who, because you need to do your own homework. Don't ask me to do your homework. I remember how well that worked out in my schooling days when I tried to force my, anyway. So, do your homework, find out where you're at, respect the history, respect the people, and find that knowledge, and then maybe for your own church, your group, that you start to find in those correct words of respecting. But it's all part of this whole process of the treaties. Again, giving respect to the Indigenous peoples and the history, the legacy that we live in. Any other questions?
Thank you, Bishop, for your presentation. When I was in Regina, this is not a question, but a statement. When I was in Regina, we had a monthly potluck, followed by a sharing circle. And it meant that people, First Nation people and non-First Nation people came together, and we just enjoyed a meal and spent time visiting, and then had a sharing circle. And there were other things that happened at different points of the year. But it was one of the special things that I found touched my heart and helped me to know a little more about the sharing circle and the healing elements of a sharing circle. And I think that perhaps this is going on here in Saskatoon, but I haven't heard of one. And I know that there's a friendship circle down on 20th Street. But anyway, I guess we need to learn more about what's going on in our areas and how we can connect and be a part of a journey forward.
I agree. We have, even within our own community, within the city itself, we have a beautiful, beautiful cultural center just to the north of us. I encourage you, take your family, go out there, learn. They have history, they have maps, they have, they invite you to even make, moccasins, your own ribbon dress. Oh my goodness, there's so many other things, cultural things that you'll learn. Be able to participate in a round dance. It would be amazing to see. And I remember the first time, one of the times I saw it, and it was in Toronto. They had it at the Rogers Center, where the roof slides back and everything else like that, where they had well over 5,000 to 7,000 people in a round dance. All nations. getting together and holding hands and dancing in a circle. I cried. It's much the same as things have changed so fast in such an amazing time. I was blessed to be able to participate in one of the first, the clergy, that Indigenous clergy, and that was in the days when you could never do a smudging ceremony inside a church, much less have a drum or an eagle feather, symbols of Indigenous spirituality. And my friend was one of the first to ever have that. And they sang an honor song for him on the drum. They had a smudging ceremony, and sweetgrass, the smell of sweetgrass and sage filled the church like incense. And the eagle feather was given to him as a gift, and a blanket placed over his shoulders in honor. I remember it because I cried, because I never thought I would ever live long enough to see that in the church that I love, except the Indigenous. If that can happen, things can change even where we are now today. So, like I said, there's hope. I live in hope. I'm the eternal optimist. Don't ask my wife that to verify that, because I am down quite a bit too. But I believe that God can bring this to fruition. That we can one day look at each other, not by who and what we look like or how we dress, but instead as children in the family of God. That's amazing. I pray for it. So, how much longer?
Andrea Otto Arose, LTS in BC, just says, thank you, Bishop Chris. Our question, what do you think decolonization of our seminary curriculum is?
Whoa, that is a big question. I believe that all the colleges across the land have been moving towards the reconciliation in answer to Call 94 calls to action. I believe that they're starting to move forward towards having more Indigenous content to understand Indigenous spirituality. For example, the smudging ceremony. What exactly is a smudging ceremony? How and who can use sweetgrass versus sage, cedar, what we call the sacred medicines, tobacco, and why are they sacred? At the same time, what's the symbolism of an eagle feather? Who can receive? If you were given an eagle feather, what should you do with it? Those kinds of symbols and elements. And I believe that the churches and the seminaries and the colleges are doing that now. It is my prayer. If they haven't, then they need to. Because understanding that what is done in BC, and hello in BC and God bless you, that what's done in BC is different from what the Plains Cree do here. As much as I found that I had to learn the whole new way of what the Mohawk do and the Ojibwe, and much less when you go to the other end to the Mi'kmaq. So, like I said, or much when you go up north and to the Gwich'in, and again up to even to Whitehorse, all the wonderful people up there, God bless them. But there is such diversity, so there's such knowledge, and the only way to really do that, especially for the colleges and seminaries, is to invite the elders to come in to teach. And that starts to happen. And so that's my invitation to all the colleges and seminaries. Invite the elders. They're the knowledge keepers. They're the history keepers. And at the same time, they're a little bit more balanced than the young people who are more militant. God bless them too. Any others? Wonderful.
Thank you for your presentation as well. Back in the time of when Idle No More movement began, Feast and Share was a church-educated event, and one of the times, two professors came to speak at St. Matthew's, and we learned about the history of assimilation on the Indigenous people. And so they gave us the story of the child at the center, and then all out from there. So it was like Feast and Share is opening up, where it's the education of the churches. And so I've been to that one. I've been to the one where I can't
tell you what church that is, St. Patrick's on the west side. And someone came to speak on the treaties. And so this is just to open that up. I think a lot of people here already probably know about the Feast and Share part of it. But that's just basically one of the you were wondering about. So I wanted to let you know that.
It does. It starts with each community and locality. I do have on my computer here one of the commitments that was written up for the church themselves, and you can change the wording to as however you want to say it, but it goes basically like this. We, the vestry, or we, the committee, we, the congregation of, name, commit ourselves to continue the work to implement the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. As part of this effort, we call upon the Government of Canada to address the call to action number 43, to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation. In particular, we call upon the Government of Canada to immediately develop policies requiring free, prior, and informed consent to be obtained from Indigenous communities in Canada and abroad with respect to developments affecting their lands and resources as outlined in Articles 10, 19, and 32 of the Declaration. It's a commitment that the people of the congregation sign and they try and strive to live into. I think with the arguments and tests that are going on right now, the challenges about land sovereignty, right now, it's not about oil. It's about being respected and listened to. That's the prior. That's the most important part. It's not about oil. Because as Indigenous people, we get very small percentage. The rest goes to the government, the rest goes to the companies. But respected and listened to. That's the main part. That's the main effort and strive to try to go with. I remember a while back, I remember that there was a monument statue of Sir John A. Macdonald that was throwing red paint on it and everything else, and they wanted to remove it. So they, somebody had the audacity to ask me what should happen, and who am I? And I said that, should we remove it? And I said, you should leave it in place. I said, because this way it marks us in history. You can't erase history. I've tried. You can't do it. You can't erase history. But if we remove that, then we can make the same mistake over and over again. It's important that we are reminded. It's important we're reminded of the legacy that we live in as Canadians and as Christians and the church. So, like I said, there's all these wonderful opportunities to learn and to grow, but it begins with us. It begins with you. It begins with us as Christians, no matter what the denomination is. But like I said, I've been wonderfully blessed to be able to be as a preacher, as a priest, as a pastor, and now as a bishop. And I get to look out and speak these words out to a lot of people. And I get to look at a lot of wonderful eyes and look into the eyes of all those that with hopefully open ears and open minds are listening. And I get to see people roll their eyes. I get to see people yawn. I get to see people going through shopping lists in their minds. Cauliflower and, cheese whiz. When's the last time we had that? So I get to see all of that. And that's because God has given me this opportunity in this moment to say these words and speak now. As much as He has brought you here today to hear, and to hear these challenging thoughts and opinions. So today, when you go out, remember that not all Indigenous people are what you have been told and taught. There's a lot of Indigenous people who are now judges, provincial judges, as you just heard from my reserve. I heard there's even a bishop. Yay! But it's us. There's professionals everywhere, and we dare not paint everybody with the same brush. Because then I look on you and I judge you. And I'm not qualified enough to be a judge over you. So, I think, if everyone will allow me, I'm going to bring our time to a close. I'm going to wish you the best in your journey of reconciliation. I pray you've learned something, maybe a new way of looking at something, a new lens. I always wanted to be an optometrist, to tell you the honest truth. Not because they get to play with all these fancy gadgets and blow in your eye, but because they always have those wonderful lenses. Does it look better this way or this way? What about this way and this way? So, those of you that do have glasses, you know how important a clear view and vision is. I pray you clear vision, a long vision to see the future and hope. I pray that you have the strength, the courage, the respect to carry forward these thoughts, these ideas. Those what we call the grandfather teachings that all nations have, how to be good people. We call them also the 10 Commandments, and how God works through all peoples in all nations to plant an emptiness here so that we hunger and seek for Him. That's what we call the journey of life and faith. And may you be blessed in your journey this day and all days to come. Amen. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Harper. And before our evening closes, by the way, I'm Bill Harrison. I'm president of Lutheran Theological Seminary, and it's Lutheran Theological Seminary that's brought you this evening. But we owe special thank you to the Association of Theological Schools, which is the larger group of theological schools to which we belong, and their project called Cultivating Educational Capacity. That's the project that has provided the funding for this evening's lecture and for some more lectures we will be undertaking. And our entry into that project is precisely to help us to take more steps in the process of decolonization in our curriculum and transforming it so that it is more reflective of the reality of a world in which we have this inheritance, the inheritance from Indigenous people of this land, is also the inheritance of our relations with Indigenous people, including the very destructive things that the Church has done, and the ways that all of those pieces are reflected in our lives and in our teaching. And so we are in the process of finding ways to welcome Indigenous people teaching at our school and to transform the things that we are teaching all the time. And so the Association of Theological Schools has invited us into this project and is helping us to fund some of that transformation. And so we thank them. Most of all, though, we thank you, Bishop Harper, and a little thank you here. And want to express our appreciation to you. We know that we have so much to learn and we have so much to do. And we really appreciate the contribution you have made this evening and the ongoing contribution you make to our lives to help us to learn and grow in reconciliation with all of God's people. So thank you.
Last thing. Remember the next time. We are one in the family of God. We are Christians first. should have set us to a higher ideal, shouldn't it? And later on, then we are our denominations. Christians first. May we walk and welcome each other with Christian grace, love and forgiveness, as God has taught and given through His Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. God bless you all. Thank you.
Cookies and coffee in the entryway. Sounds like Gordon has something else to be said.
The next lecture is series